I never thought I'd find myself talking like this. An elderly woman with nothing but memories and a heart full of regrets. They say family means everything, but I learned the hard way that it can also mean solitude. The day my children decided to cut me from the will, it felt like they severed more than just a legal bond. It was as if they carved out my very soul. I spent years knitting our family together, only to watch them unravel the fabric of our love with a single decision. I sold the house that held 40 years of laughter, tears, and countless birthday parties, turning my cherished memories into mere dollar signs. I thought it would bring me freedom, but instead, it only left me with a void that echoes through the empty rooms of my heart. Perhaps this new chapter is an opportunity, one I never expected or wanted. Before I go on, subscribe to the channel. Here, we tell stories no one else does. Stories of grandmas and grandpas the world tried to silence. The morning sunlight streamed through the sheer curtains of my small bedroom, casting a gentle glow on the worn wooden floorboards. The walls, painted a faded cream, held memories of laughter, tears, and the passage of time, each mark and scratch telling a story of its own. I sat in my rocking chair, the rhythm of its creaking a comforting companion, as I peered out the window at the familiar sights outside. The old oak tree stood proudly at the edge of my yard, its branches dancing lightly with the breeze, while the neighbor's dog barked excitedly at a passing squirrel. Life outside felt untouched, while inside, the weight of my circumstances settled upon my shoulders like a heavy blanket. I often reminisced about the way things used to be, the gatherings at my family's home, bustling with chatter and warmth. The memories left me with a bittersweet taste, a mix of joy and sorrow. My heart ached at the thought of the family dinners we once shared, where laughter echoed and love seemed unbreakable. Now it all felt like a shroud of silence draping over us, an unwelcome contrast to the vibrant past. I noticed how the clatter of plates and the warmth of shared stories had transformed into hushed conversations and strained smiles, particularly since they cut me from the will. A part of me felt unmoored, lost in this limbo of abandonment, a weight that pulsed painfully with every heartbeat. As I sat there, I couldn't help but think about the house that had been my sanctuary for decades. The walls held the laughter of my children, the warmth of family gatherings, the whispers of secrets shared in the dark. It was not just a structure filled with memories. It was the very essence of who I was. Yet now, in the wake of their betrayal, it felt like a prison, cutting me off from the life I once loved. They made the decision to sever ties over matters I never thought would come between us. The bitterness bubbled within me, a silent revenge waiting to be unleashed. I had thought that blood was thicker than water, but their actions taught me that family could be the source of the deepest wounds. The quiet of the room was interrupted only by the occasional chirp of a bird or the hum of a distant car. I glanced at the small table beside me, cluttered with unopened letters and faded photographs. Each envelope contained words I dreaded to read. Each photo was a reminder of the life I had been severed from. My fingers traced the edge of a picture from years gone by. My children, their faces full of hope and promise. I swallowed hard at the sight of my late husband's proud smile, a symbol of everything I had lost. I supposed I should have expected their behavior, the way they turned their backs when it suited them, but it still cut deeper than I could articulate. With a heavy sigh, I rose from my chair and made my way to the kitchen, the familiar sense of coffee beckoning me like an old friend. As the kettle boiled, I gazed out of the window, my thoughts swirling like the steam rising from my cup. I was going to sell it all, the furniture, the keepsakes, even the house itself. With each item I let go, I felt a tiny weight lift from my chest, replaced by a flicker of defiance, a reminder that I was still here, still standing, despite their actions. This house would no longer hold me captive. I would reclaim my life, even if it meant dismantling the remnants of the past. Somewhere deep inside, I knew that this was not just about the inheritance or the betrayal. It was about rediscovering my strength and the power of a woman who had been pushed aside. I often find myself staring out the window, watching the world outside as I sip my tea, feeling as if life has slowed to a crawl. Back then, I was a woman full of dreams, aspirations, and a sense of belonging. I look at my reflection in the glass, and I barely recognize the person I've become. Once upon a time, I was vibrant and optimistic, a bustling New Jersey girl who believed that family was everything. I remember the Sunday dinners, laughter echoing through the hallways, all of us crowded around the same table, sharing stories that seemed monumental at the time. It's almost comical to think that those days held so much promise, so much joy. And now, they've turned into something akin to a distant memory, like an old photograph fading away with time. The moment I received that letter, my heart sank. "We regret to inform you that you have been cut from the will." The words danced across the page, taunting me. It was the ultimate betrayal for a woman who believed in familial bonds, those ties that should never snap. My mind raced back to that fraught family meeting where my siblings, those I had shared my deepest secrets with, informed me they had decided I was no longer deserving of our late father's estate. The sheer shock of it all extinguished the warmth I had built for years. I felt my heart harden, a defense mechanism taking root amidst the confusion and anger. In the silence that followed that announcement, I experienced a mix of indignation and sorrow. It wasn't just about the inheritance. They had denied me a part of our family's legacy, of our shared history. Our father had worked so hard to create a life for us, and in one fell swoop, it seemed they had decided to erase my contributions, my love, and my presence. As I mulled over their betrayal, a silent rage ignited inside me. Oh, I could have lashed out, could have made a scene, but I chose a different path. I would not let their judgment define me. Instead, I decided to take control of my narrative. That's when the idea came to me. I would sell it all. I can still taste the bittersweet flavor of that decision. I sold everything they never thought I could part with, our family home, the cherished memories, and even the little trinkets that once held so much significance. As each sale was finalized, I felt an odd thrill coursing through me. It was as if I was reclaiming my power, stripping away what they had unjustly tried to take from me. Each item gone was a small victory, shifting the weight of their cruelty off my chest. I reveled in the knowledge that I could exist outside their judgment, a life not dictated by their whims. I learned through the process that I was not merely a victim. I was a survivor, crafting my own identity. What remains is a bittersweet irony. In selling the last of the family possessions, I felt a cruel sense of satisfaction, knowing that I had ultimately claimed my independence. I think back on who I was compared to who I am now, a woman who has learned the hard way that family can sometimes be the source of our deepest wounds, but also our greatest resilience. The little girl who once placed so much faith in her siblings now understands that strength often comes from within, not from the bonds we believe will always hold us up. So now, when I look into that window, I no longer just see a reflection of defeat. I see a woman standing tall, a phoenix rising amidst the ashes of betrayal and silent revenge. It was a chilly morning in November when the wind began to shift in my family's dynamics, a blustery prelude to the storm that would come to define my relationship with them. I remember standing in my kitchen, the scent of coffee mingling with the aroma of cinnamon rolls baking in the oven, when my son stepped through the door with a face that was a mixture of determination and sorrow. He had been my rock, my confidant, the one who listened without judgment. But that day, he brought news that would knock the foundation from under me. As he sat down at my kitchen table, the one that had hosted so many family gatherings, I could tell something was amiss. "Mom, we need to talk," he said, his voice steady yet wrapped in a shroud of discomfort. I braced myself, expecting perhaps a mild dispute about the holiday plans or the state of the garden. What I heard instead cut deeper than any garden spade could ever reach. He told me that my siblings had met without me, discussing the inheritance, a word that now felt like a heavy stone sinking in my stomach. The conversation had spiraled into a decision that would leave me out in the cold, my name stripped from anything they deemed valuable. It sounded too absurd to be true. I was filled with a sense of disbelief, as if I had stepped into some surreal nightmare from which I could not wake. As the gravity of their actions settled in, I felt my heart constrict. I had always been the glue of our family, the one who organized holidays, held everyone together, and cared for my aging parents until their final breaths. I had sacrificed so much, delaying my own dreams to be present for each one of them. To be cut from the will felt like a betrayal so profound it darkened every cherished memory I had. My siblings had always painted me as the family matriarch, but this act was an erasure of who I was, an attempt to rewrite the narrative they didn't like. I had been their support, their family historian, yet there I was, banished, as if I were a stranger. Then it occurred to me, this was an act of both betrayal and cowardice. They were disguising their own guilt and inadequacies through judgment and covert decisions. Rather than face me directly, they had chosen this underhanded route to shift the family wealth, believing it would pull them closer together. I could feel the anger bubbling within me, a silent rage that had long been dormant. But instead of succumbing to the anger, I felt something shift within me, a flicker of empowerment. What was their plan was intended to hurt me, a weapon they thought would sever ties, was indeed a catalyst that ignited a spark. I wasn't about to let them dictate my worth or my future, nor would I wallow in self-pity. That afternoon, after sorting through the wreckage of my emotions, I made my decision. I would sell everything I owned, the house that had witnessed a lifetime of laughter and sorrow, the heirlooms that told our family stories, the very things that tethered me to their memories. In my heart, I knew I was enacting a silent revenge, and it felt strangely liberating. I watched as the joy and warmth of my past belongings were transferred to strangers who would appreciate them differently. It was an act of reclaiming autonomy, of severing the chains that bound me to a family who no longer saw me as worthy. As I stripped myself of material things, I felt lighter, more in control of my destiny. I realized then that the true inheritance I sought was not of wealth or property, but the courage to embrace my freedom, to rewrite my own life's narrative. I looked out the window at the sprawling lawns of the neighbors, perfectly manicured and vibrant against the clear blue sky. It always struck me how much distance had grown between us over the years, physical, emotional, and now, the silence. The house next door, once a place where children laughed and played, had become a reminder of the relationships that fell apart like brittle leaves in autumn. I would see the new owners, young and bright, hosting their gatherings, laughter spilling into the air while I remained an invisible figure behind my curtains. I could hear the faint echoes of joy, but my heart felt heavy, tethered down by the weight of my own memories. Back when I was included in family gatherings, those constants in my life that I now see clearly as privileges were taken for granted. It was all so simple, sharing food, exchanging stories, and feeling like I belonged to something bigger. But when the news came that they'd cut me from the will, it felt like I was locked out of a world I had always thought was mine. It wasn't just the inheritance I lost, it was the sense of belonging, the idea that I was still part of their lives. I didn't throw a fit. I didn't lash out. Instead, silence took root inside me, a silent revenge that whispered, "You'll see." I began to sell off belongings that had once meant more than mere objects, family heirlooms, pieces of art that told our stories, trinkets from my childhood. At the time of the sales, I felt empowered, unshackling myself from the past they deemed unworthy. Each sale felt like a small reclaiming of my power, a way to channel the hurt into something tangible. I flipped the lid of my old jewelry box and found the locket my mother gave me, a simple thing, but it held my entire childhood within its tiny space. I thought about it long and hard before finally deciding to part with it. I didn't even flinch when I handed it over. I let it go, releasing what I thought was an emotional burden, but rather turned into fuel for my resolve. Silence enveloped my days as I distanced myself from the people who had once been my everything. I spent hours sitting at my kitchen table, sipping tea and tracing my fingers over the smooth surface, contemplating a life that felt more like a series of disconnected dots than a seamless tapestry. I stopped attending family functions, even the ones I had previously hosted. It was easier to avoid their laughter and the way they pretended not to see the empty chair at the table labeled with my name. It became a game of avoidance, a strategy crafted in the embers of betrayal. I envisioned the day they might look back and realize what they'd lost. My absence would echo like a missing note in a melody that was once so beautiful. As the months turned into years, the distance became comfortable, almost protective. It shielded me from the pangs of nostalgia that would sometimes strike deep, leaving me breathless with longing for what once was. Yet, in that silence, I discovered a piece of myself that had been silenced for far too long. I came to terms with what had happened, recognizing that the hurt they caused didn't define me. Instead, it shaped my resilience. This odd, bittersweet revenge in my solitude made me realize how strong I could be on my own. No longer would I be a pawn in their game of inheritance. I was the architect of my own life, claiming my space, even if it meant doing so in silence, far from their laughter that once filled my heart with joy. They always say that blood is thicker than water, but I learned too late that sometimes it can feel like poison. In my younger years, I never imagined that family could turn on you like a pack of wolves. Yet, here I am, an old woman, nursing a wound that runs deeper than I thought possible. When I received that letter, cold, formal, and utterly devoid of warmth, it felt as though the ground had shifted beneath my feet. The words cut into me more sharply than any knife, leaving an ache that neither time nor distance could fully heal. They had gathered for a family meeting, and I was naive enough to think it would be about my late husband's estate. We had always talked about family matters together, sharing decisions through thick and thin. But this time, it felt like I was walking into a trap. I still remember that day vividly. The sun was shining, but I felt a chill in the air. The room was filled with tension and unspoken resentment. They sat there with their arms crossed like soldiers ready for battle, and I, an unarmed civilian, walked right into their line of fire. As the eldest sister, I thought I would have a say in what happened next. After all, I had been there through every family crisis, from births to deaths, and everything in between. Yet, the air crackled with a sense of betrayal as one of my younger siblings read aloud from the will. And to my beloved children, I leave my estate in New Jersey. I held my breath, waiting for my name to be called, but it never was. Instead, they moved on, outlining their shares as if I were nothing more than an afterthought, a ghost haunting the very foundations of my own family. The words, "You have been cut from the will," rang out in my head long after the last syllable faded into the silence. I can't describe the mix of emotions that flooded over me. Shock, disbelief, but most of all, a raw, gnawing hurt. How could it come to this? I had given them everything: love, support, even my time. And yet, here I was, completely disregarded, cast aside as though I were an unwanted piece of furniture. I remember looking around the room at their smug faces, trying to hold back the tears that threatened to spill over. In that moment, I resolved that I wouldn't allow this betrayal to define me. Instead, I conjured a fierce determination to take my life back into my own hands, to reclaim the power they thought they had stripped from me. I took stock of my life and realized that the only way to regain my footing was to sever those toxic ties. I may have lost the inheritance, but I had something they couldn't take from me: my will to survive. I began selling my possessions, one by one, not out of desperation, but as a form of silent revenge. With every item that left my house, I felt lighter, more liberated. I was dismantling the very life they thought they had set aside for me. Every sale was my way of telling them I wouldn't remain a victim. I would thrive, even in their absence. Each transaction became a small victory, a reclaiming of my identity that they had tried so hard to erase. So yes, they cut me from the will, but they didn't cut me from my life. I sat at my kitchen table, the late afternoon sunlight streaming through the window, casting long shadows across the faded linoleum. The scent of brewed coffee wafted through the air, a familiar comfort as I stared down at the cold, untouched cup. It was only a few weeks ago that my granddaughter caught me off guard with a question I thought I had buried long ago. "Grandma, what was it like when you were younger?" she asked, her eyes bright with curiosity. At that moment, I felt the walls closing in on me, as if the past had come rushing back, demanding to be acknowledged. I could almost hear the echoes of whispers that had lingered through decades, remnants of a family secret that I had kept to myself, believing that silence was my protection. I had been cut from the will, not exactly a surprise, given the brewing storms that had accumulated over the years. The air had grown thick with resentment ever since my uncle's death. His belongings, the ones I thought would come to me, were suddenly off limits, snatched away by the very people I had called family. I'd always understood the dynamics of our family, the undertones of favoritism that shrieked louder than any sweet family gathering. But this was something else entirely, a stinging betrayal that shoved me into a corner I had never wanted to occupy. I didn't think I could feel more isolated than I already did, but there it was, sharper than any knife, sharper than any word spoken in anger. Deep down, I had always wondered if my grandmother had known that I would be left out, if she had planned it all along. The inheritance, the family heirlooms, those precious memories that had become symbols of love and legacy, nothing felt sacred when they were taken from me, suddenly rendered unworthy in the eyes of those who claimed to honor our lineage. I would hear them laughing at family gatherings, their voices rising above the mundane chatter, as if they had won some grand prize in life. Meanwhile, I stood against the wall, feeling the warmth of familial bonds turning to ice, the very air heavy with grudges that had festered beneath the surface. I was more than just a casualty. I was a silent witness to their cruelty. And then it happened. The day I packed up my entire life from that house seemed so straightforward, yet agonizing. I had sold everything of value merely to detach myself from them, to cut the remaining strings that bound me to a legacy tinged with resentment. I thought selling my past would provide me with closure, but it only unwrapped the real treasures my grandmother had left behind. Secrets held tightly within the walls, stories buried under layers of time. I found her diaries, yellowed pages filled with tales of her youth, love affairs, and the heartaches that shaped her. It was as if I had unearthed a hidden map to understanding not just the family I was trying to escape, but the woman whose blood ran through my veins. I could no longer ignore the truth. These pages bore witness to the same pain I had experienced, though I was too blinded by my anger to see it before. She had hidden her secrets from me, perhaps in an effort to save me from the same fate. But here I was, fighting battles that felt like they belonged to someone else. Anger turned to understanding, and I began to wonder if I had the power to rewrite my own narrative. The journal entries spoke of rebellion, of choices made in the pursuit of happiness that had led to isolation. Maybe this was my call to action, to wind my way through the tangled mess of legacy and find my own voice amid the dissonance. It was time to let go of the resentment, pick up the pieces, and create my own path, away from the shadows of betrayal and towards an uncharted future that was, finally, my own. I remember that day as if it were etched in my mind with a chisel. It was a bright Sunday afternoon, the sun pouring through the kitchen window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. I had spent the morning preparing my famous pot roast, a family recipe handed down through generations. It was my way of showing love, of bringing the family together around the table. But that warmth was shattered the moment my son, Henry, walked into my kitchen with the news that would haunt me for years to come. He told me they had cut me from the will, just like that, as if I were a stray piece of tape they no longer needed. The words felt like a slap across my face, so unexpected and yet somehow not surprising. The family I had devoted my life to, the one I had poured everything into, made their decision without even blinking. It was a wound that opened up that day, one that would never quite heal. I didn't understand how it had come to this. I had given my all to my children, sacrificing my dreams, my ambitions, to ensure they had everything they needed. And now, here they were, dismissing me as if I was nothing but a burden they no longer wanted. I can still feel the rawness of that moment, the betrayal twisting in my chest like a knife. I wanted to scream, to make them understand the hurt I was feeling, but all that came out was silence. I forced myself to keep my chin up, to act as if their decision didn't pierce right through me. If that's how they feel, then so be it, I told myself. But inside, I was trembling. I spent the entire day going through the motions, putting on a brave face for my son, who looked just as pained as I felt. Little did I know that my resolve would begin to transform into something else entirely, a silent, simmering anger that would fuel my next actions. I decided then and there that I would not let them rob me of my dignity. The days turned into weeks, and I watched as my once tightly knit family continued on without me. They gathered for dinners without sending an invitation my way, celebrated birthdays and milestones, and I remained invisible, a ghost lingering on the periphery of the life I had built. Every time I saw photos on social media, pristine smiles and warm embraces, it felt like a knife was twisting in my gut. I was reminded of how easily they had chosen their inheritance over the person who had raised them. I started to think of things I could do to reclaim some power over the situation. Selling my possessions became a form of reprisal, a way to claim back my narrative, the items I once cherished, the furniture my husband and I had picked out together, the family heirlooms I had hoped to pass down. Each sale felt like a weight lifted off my shoulders and simultaneously a new wound I created. I felt liberated as I handed over the last of my mother's china to a stranger, each piece accompanied by whispered memories that faded with every transaction. In my heart, I knew that every sale was a testament to their choice, a silent revenge that left me feeling both victorious and hollow. I didn't need their money. I needed their acknowledgement, their love. But perhaps that was asking too much from people who had forgotten the value of family in exchange for something as fickle as material wealth. In my mind, the battle wasn't over yet. It was an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, one of those days when the sky hung low and gray over New Jersey, as if the world was casting a shadow in solidarity with my sour mood. I was sitting on the porch, the wood creaking under my weight, nursing a cup of lukewarm tea and a few bruised memories. The last few years had been a series of unfortunate events, a real-life soap opera without the glitz and glamour. After being unceremoniously cut from my late sister's will, I had sold the family heirlooms and moved into this modest home, determined to carve out a new life. It was all bittersweet, but I had found some semblance of peace within the chaos. At least, I thought I had. As I stared out at the backyard, watching the leaves scatter across the ground like discarded thoughts, the sound of tires crunching on gravel jolted me from my reverie. I turned my head just in time to see a familiar car pulling into the driveway. My heart raced, though I couldn't say if it was from excitement or dread. It had been years since I'd laid eyes on any of them. My nephew, Derek, and his family. They were the ones who'd shared in my sister's decision to cut me out of her will, all of them believing they were entitled to what little was left. I had buried that hurt deep, but now it felt like a gaping wound, crashing back to the surface. When they stepped out of the car, the sight of them took my breath away. Derek was all grown up, a man now, rather than the boy I remembered. He carried himself with an air of confidence, and there was a woman beside him, his wife, I presumed. 2 children bounced out of the back, a girl and a boy, wide-eyed and fidgety with that childhood exuberance. They approached the porch, and I felt a mix of anger and sadness surging through me. Did they come to gloat? To remind me of what I had lost? Or perhaps, in some twisted turn of fate, they came to offer an olive branch? The uncertainty gnawed at me. "Hello, Aunt Margot," Derek said, his voice warm and somewhat hesitant. "It's been a while." The way he said it almost felt like an apology, but the edge of my bitterness couldn't appreciate the sentiment. The memories of the family gatherings, the laughter, and the love now felt tainted. Just like that, I was thrust back into my past. The arguments, the accusations, the pleading that fell on deaf ears. My gaze shifted to the children, innocent and unaware of the tangled adult drama that had unfurled long before they were born. It tore at my heart, the juxtaposition of their joy against my sorrow. Before I could respond, the little girl tugged on my sleeve, brightening the moment with her innocent curiosity. "Are you my great-aunt?" she asked, her eyes sparkling with wonder, completely oblivious to the heaviness that hovered in the air. I was taken aback, momentarily speechless. A part of me wanted to embrace her and sweep her into my arms, to hold on to the love that did exist within this fractured family. But the bitterness stung too hard, and I felt the wall I had built around my heart begin to tremble. That unspoken rivalry, the desire for validation and connection, clashed within me as the warmth of their presence encroached upon my solitude. A reunion, albeit unexpected and fraught with tension, had begun to unfold on my porch, and I stood at the precipice of reconciling who I was with who I could still become. I remember the day I first spotted the cut in the will like it was yesterday. The glossy paper caught the afternoon sunlight streaming through the living room window, a glaring reminder of the family I had supported my entire life. They gathered around the polished table, their faces a mix of satisfaction and apprehension, while I sat there, heart pounding in my chest. My son, Eric, shifted nervously in his chair as the lawyer read off the list of beneficiaries. When my name was omitted like an afterthought, it felt as if the air had been sucked out of the room. I wanted to scream, to confront them then and there, but I stayed quiet. I had learned over many years that silence can sometimes be the loudest statement of all. After that day, the silence grew between us like a thick fog, heavy and suffocating. I noticed every small interaction, every dismissive glance, every hushed whisper that echoed in the hallways of my home. Eric would come over for dinner, but the laughter I once cherished became strained, a forced performance meant to mask the gaping hole left by my exclusion. I couldn't help but reflect on all the sacrifices I had made for them. The nights spent working overtime to ensure they had everything they could possibly want, from piano lessons to summer camps. I had poured my heart into our family, yet here I was, an afterthought, a non-entity in the life I had built. I felt the anger swell inside me, a quiet storm beneath the surface. At first, I didn't know what to do with it. I began to take stock of everything I had accumulated over the years, the possessions that meant something to me. With each item I touched, my grandmother's china, the vintage record player I had cherished since my youth, I felt a sense of betrayal twisting in my gut. I decided then that I would sell it all, piece by piece, and in doing so, I would find not only a way to regain my independence, but also a sense of closure. Maybe it was revenge, but more than that, it was a reclamation of my identity. The first item I sold was my beloved rocking chair. How many hours had I spent in that chair, nursing Eric as a baby, reading books, and knitting scarves? It hurt to part with it, but as soon as the transaction was complete, a weight lifted off my shoulders. One sale turned into another, and I found empowerment in the act of letting go. Each sale felt like a small act of rebellion against the injustice of being sidelined, a way to assert my existence outside the boundaries they had constructed for me. I envisioned every dollar I earned as a step away from their approval and more towards my own self-worth. The day I closed the final deal felt surreal. I stood in my empty living room, eerily silent yet liberating, reflecting on the chaos that had unfolded. It wasn't just about the things I had sold. It was about reclaiming my narrative after being written out. I had delivered the ultimate silent revenge, one that didn't rely on threats or confrontation, but rather on my ability to rise above their pettiness. I didn't need their inheritance to validate my worth. I had built a life worth living long ago, and now, in this space of emptiness, I felt filled with something different, a profound sense of freedom. I still remember the day my daughter, Rebecca, called to tell me the news. We had been estranged for years, ever since she thought it was wise to marry that man from New York, the one with all that charm and none of the backbone. I was sitting on my porch, the sun warming my tired bones, when her name flashed on my phone. I didn't want to answer, but curiosity got the better of me. The moment I heard her voice, I knew something was off. "Mom," she said, hesitating like she was testing the waters. "Can you sit down? I need to tell you something." A sinking feeling washed over me. I braced myself for the worst. What could it be? A life-threatening illness? An accident? But what came next was more hurtful than I could have imagined. "Dad, he changed his will. He cut you out, Mom. You're no longer part of the inheritance." Just like that, my heart shattered into pieces. Years of sacrifices, of love and support, all tossed aside as if they meant nothing. Anger surged through me, hot and blinding. How could this happen? But deep down, I sensed that this was the culmination of a long and bitter war. Not just about money, but about family, loyalty, and love that had gone stale. I felt betrayed, not just by him, but by my own daughter for being complicit in this decision. I wanted to scream, to hurl insults, to remind them of everything I had done for this family. Instead, I swallowed those words, choosing silence as my weapon. I hung up the phone, my heart racing, my mind a whirlwind of thoughts. In the days that followed, I found solace in action. If they thought they could erase me from their lives so easily, they were sorely mistaken. I decided to sell everything I owned that tied me to this house and their memory. The dining room set from my grandmother, The china I had saved for special occasions. Everything. I took pictures of each piece, holding my breath as I watched those memories slip away. But each sold item felt like a small victory, allowing me to reclaim my independence. It was a slow process, and with each trinket I parted with, a sense of liberation washed over me. I realized I had been shackled by their expectations for far too long. As the last piece of furniture vanished from my home, I felt lighter, yet a tinge of sadness lingered. I had spent decades building a life around them, memories made in these walls, the laughter and tears echoing in every room. But now, it was time to build something new, something that was entirely my own. I closed the door behind me, locking up the remnants of a past life, and stepped into the unknown. I felt a flicker of hope mixed with rebellion. I no longer needed the validation of my family. I had closed the door to one chapter and opened another. I would create a legacy of my own, one that didn't depend on those who had chosen to erase me. That silent revenge tasted sweeter than I had anticipated, and as I walked away, I realized that I was finally free. It's an odd feeling, being both the matriarch of a family and yet rendered invisible in the eyes of the very people you once held close. You see, my family had this way of ensuring I knew my place. I was never meant to be a burden, but somehow, needing to be acknowledged seemed like a crime. After they cut me from the will, I thought perhaps it was my own fault for having raised children who could turn so cold. But the truth was much deeper and more painful. It was as if they wanted to erase me entirely, my contributions to their lives disregarded, my sacrifices dismissed. At family gatherings, I could feel the tension hanging in the air like a thick fog. You could almost choke on it. The laughter rang hollow, a chorus of hypocrisy layered with mistrust. I watched my daughter, Claire, who used to sit on my lap as a child, now deliberately avoiding my gaze. I had no choice but to embrace my outsider status as I stood at the fringes, a ghost in my own family. It was almost comical. My estranged son would allow himself to be so cold even while wrapped in that sweater I knitted for him years ago. Every smile exchanged felt like a reminder of what they had taken from me, not just in tangible assets, but in affection and recognition. In the wake of my disinheritance, there was this unspoken tension bubbling beneath the surface. They didn't just cut me from the will, they cut me from their lives in a way. They didn't want to deal with the fallout of their decision, nor did they want my voice tainting their newfound freedom. They saw my anger and sadness as a threat. So I decided to sell everything I had left, my belongings, the trinkets of my past that once held memories of love, laughter, and sleepless nights spent tending to their needs. It felt like I was taking back control, even if only in the most superficial way. I didn't need their approval any longer. I had my own sense of pride, wrapped tightly around me like a warm blanket. The people in my community had their share of opinions about my situation, of course. Some came to offer their sympathy, while others were more judgmental, assuming I must have done something terribly wrong to deserve such treatment. Little did they know, the truth was much murkier. I overheard whispers in the grocery store, discussions about poor Mrs. Thompson and how she seemed lost without her family. I wanted to shout at them, tell them how I had been a part of my children's every success, every heartbreak, and yet here I was, an afterthought. And yet, perhaps, it was easier to keep it bottled up. It was my silent revenge, allowing them to think whatever they wanted while I moved on with my life. Ultimately, my experience has shown me the irony of family. It's a strange dance of love and betrayal that we all perform, often without even realizing it. I watch others cling to their grudges and grievances, but I've learned to let go. I am not the bitter woman they think I am. Rather, I am resilient. The decision to sell it all was a cleansing act for me. I could no longer be defined by their choices or their perceptions of me. As much as they wanted to erase me, I found my own way to rise from the ashes of their betrayal. After all, it's not about what I was cut from, but what I chose to build afterward. Whether or not they care is entirely irrelevant. My life, my joy, and my legacy are mine to claim, with or without their recognition. I find myself staring at the walls of my modest apartment, the faint smell of lavender from the sachets I placed in the corners drifting through the rooms. It's a small comfort, but one I've come to cherish. These walls bear witness to years of laughter, tears, and memories, some beautiful, some painful. Yet they all remind me of the life I lived before the fractures in my family became so pronounced. I sift through the remnants of what was once a shared existence, where love met obligation and loyalty was intertwined with expectation. The quietness of my home now feels almost deafening, a stark contrast to the boisterous gatherings we used to have. The day they cut me out of the will stung more than I expected. The lawyer's office, cold and sterile, was filled with more animosity than I could have anticipated. I sat there, trying to understand how my children could sit across from me, stone-faced, while they dissected my worth like I was some sort of asset. "We believe it's best for family harmony," they said, as if my absence would heal the wounds they thought were festering. Little did they know that it was their actions that caused those very rifts. I felt like a ghost in my own life, witnessing the betrayal of my own flesh and blood. In those moments of betrayal, something shifted within me. I began to see the world not through their lens, but through my own. No more would I be the meek matron, waiting silently for their approval or love. I had spent decades trying to please them, to fill their needs, while neglecting my own desires and dreams. The brokenness of the inheritance felt like a door swinging wide open, and though I had initially perceived it as a loss, it soon transformed into a catalyst for rediscovery. Selling the family heirlooms that had once held so much sentimental value became a way to reclaim my autonomy. Each item gone was a reminder of the chains I no longer wanted to wear. The process wasn't easy. I had to confront the memories tied to each piece, and though I felt sorrow, I also unearthed a sense of freedom. The ornate silverware that once gleamed at holiday dinners became merely metal, stripped of its power over me. Yes, I could feel the sting of nostalgia, the sharp edge of memories that flooded my mind, but it paled in comparison to the liberation that accompanied letting go. I found solace in downsizing, realizing that I didn't need the past to validate my existence or my worth. I was carving out space in my life, not for them, but for me, something I had neglected for so long. This internal reckoning drew me to revisit old passions buried beneath years of family obligations. I picked up my paintbrush again, feeling the smooth surface of the canvas, whispering promises of expression. Art had always been a refuge for me. It was where I poured my heart without the fear of judgment. It became my quiet rebellion against the life I had been forced into. Each stroke was a declaration of independence, a voice rising against the silence of history. As colors swirled together on the canvas, I felt more alive than I had in ages, as though I was reclaiming not just my past, but also my future. I sit now, looking at the pieces I've created, and I find that they embody all the emotions I can no longer suppress: the hurt, the anger, but also the hope and renewal. I am learning to embrace my own story, flawed and fractured as it may be. The inheritance they withheld does not define me. It has instead propelled me toward a path of rediscovery. I am not simply an extension of their lives. I am my own person, resilient and unyielding. So, while they may have cut me from the will, I have emerged, fiercely alive, carving out a life that is authentically my own. When I first learned that I had been cut from my parents' will, I felt my whole world tilt on its axis. I had always assumed that the family I had given everything to would want to support me as I aged. Heck, I dedicated decades to caring for my mother as her health declined, often sacrificing my own life and independence. I remember how she used to tell me that blood is thicker than water, and I took those words to heart. But they cut me out with a fine-tipped knife, right where it hurt the most. In that moment, I realized I had been living in a fairy tale of my own making, blind to the reality that existed around me. I spent days sulking and grappling with the gravity of what had happened. My siblings, whom I had loved dearly despite our growing differences over the years, had decided that I was not worthy of sharing in the fruits of my parents' labor. I remember sitting on my porch, the sun glaring down at the empty, grayed-out lawn that had once been so full of life. I had fed those flowers, watered them, and now they stood as a testament to the neglect I felt in my family. I thought about how my mother had always turned a blind eye to my unyielding efforts, taking me for granted while my siblings were favored despite their distance from home. It was like a rotten fruit, a constant reminder of my worthlessness. At first, my instinct was to confront them, to demand an explanation. But as days turned into weeks, I felt a cold resolve settle in my bones. Rather than lash out, I chose to channel that hurt into making a life for myself. I gathered up the few belongings that meant something to me, putting aside notions of nostalgia, and began selling everything I could. The antique dining set we had shared countless family meals on became just another piece of furniture to be bartered. I felt a twisted sense of liberation as I watched the pieces of our family history change hands. With every sale, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders, like a burgeoning phoenix ready to rise from its ashes. Selling everything wasn't just about money. It was about reclaiming my own narrative. I wanted to write my story in bold strokes, making sure that I was the one holding the pen. There was this empowering feeling each time I met a stranger to hand over a piece of my past. I had some enlightening conversations with those who visited, people with stories that mirrored my own, tales of loss and familial strife. In those moments, I found solace, a connection that filled the void left by my family. I realized I wasn't completely alone in the world, and that was worth more than any heirloom I had lost. In the end, I did not get the reconciliation I had hoped for. My siblings never reached out, and maybe that was their way of punishing me too. But I no longer cared as much as I used to. I had made my peace, both with the past and the choices they made. I had become strong in my own right, not as their sister, but as an independent woman. The revenge I sought was not vindictive. It was a quiet self-assuredness that resonated within me. I was no longer their scapegoat or the dutiful child. I had cut ties, not with them, but with the victim narrative I had lived. I had sold my inheritance, and in doing so, I earned something far more valuable: my freedom. It's strange how the heart can hold on to memories like a sticky note on the fridge, even when the fridge is empty. I remember the day the will was read, like a scene frozen in time. My children sat across the table from me. Those eager faces, once brimming with love, turned to cold masks of indifference. My name was barely a whisper, just a fleeting mention among the names of my siblings, who were eager to claim what they had long believed was theirs. The feeling of being cut out of their lives, erased from the family narrative, was like a knife twisting in my gut. They thought they could take what I had provided, my years of tending to every family need, and wash their hands of me all in one fell swoop. I could see the smirks on their faces, how they hid their glee behind polite smiles and forced laughter. They thought I wouldn't fight back, that I would simply fade away, like an old photograph left out too long in the sun. But I wasn't ready to slip quietly into the night. I had given them my love, my time, and in return, I was entitled to some form of acknowledgement. They thought the material possessions were all that mattered, but what they didn't understand was that it was never just about money or a house. It was about legacy. With each item I sold, each family heirloom I let go, I felt like I was reclaiming a little piece of myself they had stripped away. I held on to my father's old pocket watch for a while, its ticking a reminder of the moments we shared. I could see his hands, calloused from hard work, winding that watch each morning as if to capture time itself. But what good was it if my children saw it only as a tangible asset? So, I sold it. I sold it to a young man who looked at it with wonder, and I could almost see my father smiling from wherever he was, pleased that someone would appreciate its history rather than dismiss it as mere junk. With every trinket that left my hands, I felt lighter, unraveling like an old sweater that had seen too many winters. This was my silent rebellion, my final gesture of defiance against a family that thought they could write me out of the story. As each object was claimed by strangers, I took pride in knowing I was transferring memories, not just possessions. Each sale felt like a small victory against the numbness that had begun to suffocate me. There was a satisfaction in watching the joy on others' faces, knowing they would treasure these items rather than allow them to gather dust in some forgotten corner of a well-furnished home. They had robbed me of my place in the family, but I still had the power to shape my own narrative. This wasn't just about the material things. It was about claiming my dignity, my autonomy, reasserting who I was in a world that had suddenly grown so unrecognizable. Eventually, I found myself sitting in the very house they had deemed more worthy than my presence. I looked around at the bare walls, the voids where cherished memories once danced like sunlight. I realized that I had carved out a new space within myself, one where I could thrive without the weight of resentment dragging me down. I had sold it all, yes, but what I gained in return was something infinitely more valuable: freedom. In that empty house full of echoes, I found solace. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and moved forward, unfettered by the chains they had tried to bind me with. I sit here, cradling a steaming cup of tea in my hands, the warmth seeping into my palms like a gentle reminder of the life I've lived. It's quiet now in my little apartment, the world outside bustling with the noise of cars and voices. But within these four walls, I find solace. Reflecting on the past brings with it a mixture of pain and strength, a cacophony of memories that swirl into clarity. They cut me from the will, but in truth, they did more than that. They severed the ties that bound me to a legacy I had built brick by brick, through love and toil, only to have it tossed aside like yesterday's newspaper. I remember the day they gathered around, feigning concern while the lawyer laid out the terms. The look in their eyes betrayed them. I could see it, their anticipation of what they would gain at my expense. It hurt, yes, like a sharp knife digging into my chest, but I refused to let them see my pain. There was a strength rising within me that day, a quiet resolve that had been tucked away for far too long. It was as if I could hear the echoes of my late husband's voice, reminding me that revenge is often sweeter when served silently. So, I began to forge a path of my own, one that didn't rely on their approval or acceptance. Selling everything was like shedding an old skin. Each item was a memory, a trinket from a vacation, a piece of furniture that had witnessed our laughter and tears. I held each piece in my hands, feeling the weight of our shared history, but I let them go one by one. With each sale, the chains of expectation clinked away, and what remained was a newfound freedom that I didn't know I so desperately needed. My heart was heavy, yet exhilaratingly light, as I felt the air shift around me. Finally, I was reclaiming my narrative, reasserting my identity outside the boundaries they imposed. I took the profits and poured them into my health, my passions, the things that made my heart sing. I enrolled in a painting class, something I had dreamed of doing for years but had always put on the back burner, convinced there was never enough time. Each brushstroke was a catharsis. The canvas became a refuge where I could explore the depths of my soul without judgment. I painted my anger, my joy, the entire palette of my existence. I learned to dance again, to laugh more freely, and to embrace the richness of life that I had stifled for too long. Somewhere along the way, I discovered that the most precious inheritance was not a sum of money or possessions, but the vibrancy of my spirit. Now, as I sit here and reflect, I find peace in my solitude. My dreams are no longer shackled to another's whims. I've carved out a space for myself that is entirely my own, and it feels powerful. I still think about them sometimes, the family I lost in the process of cutting ties, but the bitterness that once colored my thoughts has dissolved into acceptance. They may have cut me out, but they ultimately granted me the greatest gift, the opportunity to reclaim my life. I've learned that real strength lies not in holding on to grudges or seeking retaliation, but in weaving a life filled with joy, authenticity, and resilience, one brushstroke at a time. As I sit here, the sun casting a gentle glow through my window, I find a calmness that has settled within me. Life has a peculiar way of weaving its threads, sometimes leaving behind frayed edges and bittersweet memories. Losing what I once thought would always be mine was painful, yet it has also gifted me a sense of freedom. I've learned that possessions do not define us. They are merely containers for the stories we carry. I remember the laughter shared, the tears shed, and the lessons learned over cups of tea with loved ones. Those moments, fleeting as they are, remain etched in my heart. I can breathe a little easier now, knowing that I may have sold the material remnants of my past, but I have kept the essence of all those cherished connections alive within me. So, as I embrace this chapter of acceptance, I'm reminded that life is but a collection of stories, some joyful, some heartbreaking, all beautifully intertwined. If you listened until the end, thank you. Leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments which city you're watching from. Maybe the next story we tell here will be yours.